In the frozen forests of Finland, a lone soldier waited, invisible, silent, and utterly unafraid. By autumn 1939, war had consumed Europe, and on Finland's eastern border, a storm was gathering. Finland, small, isolated and pressed against the Soviet frontier, stood almost entirely alone. The Soviet Union was the largest nation on Earth, with the largest army in the world. In the Kremlin, Stalin studied his maps and decided that Finland's independence was a security problem. Moscow delivered its demands: buffer zones, military bases, and Finnish territory along the Karelian border. The Finnish parliament convened in grim silence, a democratic nation weighing the cost of defiance. Finland Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, 72 years old, walked his defensive line and prepared for what was coming. Across Finland, ordinary life continued: families, fires, and frozen lakes, unaware that peace had hours left. At dawn on November 30th, 1939, the entire Soviet front erupted. The Winter War had begun. 3 Soviet armies crossed the Finnish border simultaneously. Over 450,000 soldiers advancing into the frozen north. Soviet bombers appeared over Helsinki within hours, a European capital under attack on the first morning. Buildings burned. Smoke rose over the city. Finland was at war, and the world was watching. Across Finland, men threw on their uniforms and ran a nation mobilizing in breathless, stumbling urgency. The Karelian Isthmus, 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest, was where Finland would have to hold. The Mannerheim Line, concrete, wire, and frozen earth, the defensive barrier Finland had spent years building. Finnish soldiers took their positions in the snow, checked their weapons, and faced east without flinching. Soviet tanks emerged from the tree line and crossed the open field. The defenders watched them come. Finnish anti-tank teams had trained for exactly this moment, and they were not afraid of tanks. The lead Soviet vehicles burned. The road was blocked. The column behind it had nowhere to go. The Finnish sniper was invisible, lying in open snow, patient and still, a ghost with a rifle. By morning, the road was silent, Soviet soldiers and horses and machines frozen together in the snow. Finnish commanders reviewed the maps with quiet astonishment. Their soldiers were performing beyond all expectation. Inside Soviet headquarters, the mood was very different: confusion, blame, and the weight of unexpected failure. Finland's greatest weapon was not its army, it was the vast, merciless, impenetrable winter forest. Soviet columns pushed deeper into the wilderness, dark columns moving through trees that seemed to close behind them. Finnish ski troops moved through the forest at night, silent, white, and entirely at home in the dark. The ambush lasted seconds, muzzle flashes, chaos, and then silence. The attackers, already gone into the trees. From above, the trap was visible: Soviet column on the road, Finnish lines closing from both sides. The temperature fell to -40 degrees. The Soviet army was not equipped for Finnish winter. Men froze. Soviet soldiers built fires to survive, and the fires made them visible for hundreds of meters in every direction. Finnish ski troops hit the campfire positions and vanished. Strike, shatter, disappear. At Suomussalmi, the map told a merciless story. A Soviet army walking into a Finnish The Soviet 44th Division stretched along the forest road for kilometers, halted, freezing, and completely surrounded. Finnish forces cut the road at both ends, and the largest Soviet column in Finland ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soviet artillery pieces sat abandoned in the snowdrifts, never unlimbered, never used, claimed by the Finnish winter. Finnish soldiers moved through the captured Soviet supplies, practical men taking what they needed to keep fighting. Soviet vehicles burned through the Finnish night. Orange fire against blue darkness, warmth turned into destruction. The prisoners moved slowly through the snow, the survivors of two divisions that had walked into Finland's forests. Finnish commanders studied the Suomussalmi maps. The numbers were almost impossible to believe, so they checked them again. The final assault on the last Soviet pocket was methodical Finnish lines, converging from every direction simultaneously. Soviet military order collapsed completely, every man making his own calculation about survival in the frozen forest. The battlefield stretched 4 kilometers, thousands of Soviet soldiers, and their equipment, already being covered by snow. A Finnish soldier stood at the lake's edge and looked out alive, which was its own kind of miracle. Newspapers across the world carried the same story. A small country was humiliating one of the world's great armies. In the Kremlin, Stalin stood over his maps in controlled fury. The plans had failed catastrophically.
The tribunal finds your excuses unacceptable, Comrade General. The cost of your incompetence is staggering.
The Soviet military machine responded to humiliation the only way it knew how, with overwhelming industrial mass. Finnish reserves moved into their positions, thin lines against what was coming, but they moved without hesitation. The Mannerheim Line's concrete had held through December and January, but February would test it beyond all previous limits. Finnish engineers worked through the night under fire, reinforcing, repairing, doing what engineers do when everything depends on them. The Soviet February bombardment was unlike anything that had come before. The entire horizon became a wall of fire. Inside the bunkers, Finnish soldiers held each other and the walls, and waited for what they could not prevent. Soviet infantry advanced in wave after wave across the open snow, a human tied against the Finnish line. Finnish machine gunners held their fire until the range was certain, then opened up, and did not stop. Wave after wave broke against the Finnish line, and still the waves came, because there were always more waves. The ammunition boxes were opening and finding nothing. The Finnish line was holding, but the margin was shrinking. Mannerheim walked the line, and the soldiers straightened when they saw him command presence as a form of ammunition. Swedish volunteers arrived at Finnish ports, men who came by choice, because some things are worth crossing a border for. Foreign aid arrived at Finnish docks, real, appreciated, and insufficient against the scale of what Finland was facing. November became December, became January, became February, the war grinding deeper into winter, and Finland grinding with it. Soviet air power intensified, Finnish anti-aircraft fire rose and fell short. And the bombers continued without breaking formation. Pengia civilians moved north and west in long convoys, orderly, exhausted, carrying what they could, and leaving the rest. Pengia children waited at railway stations in the snow, wearing their coats, and holding small bags, and understanding nothing. A Finnish soldier wrote a letter home by candlelight, choosing his words carefully, writing everything that needed to be said. Through the January nights, Finnish and Soviet artillery spoke to each other, across the dark, in fire and light. Soviet armor massed along the Finnish line in February. More tanks than had been deployed in any previous assault. On February 11, 1940, the horizon from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga erupted simultaneously. The final offensive had begun. The Soviet bombardment of February was not preparatory, it was an attempt to physically destroy the Mannerheim Line. Inside the damaged bunkers, Finnish soldiers worked in darkness, clearing rubble, treating wounds, continuing to fight. On February 11th, the Soviet line broke through at summer. The Mannerheim Line had finally been offended. Finnish defenders fell back in disciplined withdrawal, covering each other, trading space for time, maintaining their dignity. Village after village burned as the Finnish line contracted, the retreat leaving fire behind it as a final signature. Mannerheim drew the withdrawal line on the map, and set down the pencil, and did not speak for a long moment. Finnish infantry marched west through the snowstorm alive, unbroken, retreating, and still a fighting army after 105 days. Vyborg, Finland's second city, was under assault, its skyline visible through smoke and the fire of Soviet artillery. The Finnish cabinet gathered an emergency session. The question before them was whether Finland still existed as a viable state. Finnish representatives arrived in Moscow to negotiate peace, carrying the weight of everything Finland had fought for and lost. The Soviet terms were laid on the table: 11% of Finnish territory, including the city of Vyborg, to be ceded. The Finnish delegation held their pens above the documents, grief and duty, sitting together in a very small room. On March 13, 1940, at noon, the armistice took effect, and 105 days of war ended in a Moscow building. The ceasefire order reached Finnish positions along the entire front, and soldier by soldier, the weapons came down. The line fell silent. After 105 days of continuous war, silence felt wrong. It took time to trust it. A Finnish soldier lowered his rifle into the snow and looked east at the silence where the enemy had been. Soviet forces moved into the ceded territories. Finnish soldiers watched from the withdrawal line in silence. Faces unreadable. 410,000 Finnish Karelians moved west in the winter cold, carrying Finland with them in the only way that mattered. Empty Finnish farmhouses stood in the abandoned territory, fires still barely warm, photographs still on the walls. Karelia was silent now, empty fields, empty roads, frozen lakes, unmarked by the people who had lived there all their lives. The Finnish flag flew at full mast, blue cross on white, snapping in the March wind, defiant and sovereign. The peace treaty confirmed Finland's territorial losses, but the map still showed a Finland intact and free. The Soviet Union lost 125,000 dead against Finland's 25,000. The arithmetic of the Winter War was staggering. 25,000 Finns did not come home. Their white crosses stood in rows in the silence of winter cemeteries. The world's democracies had watched Finland stand with admiration and could offer little more than admiration in return.
Finland, her dignity and courage in the face of aggression are unequaled.
Mannerheim sat alone in the quiet of his study, an old man who had held the country together with his presence. Finnish soldiers came home to quiet reunions, faces that did not easily find joy after 3 months of winter war. Families sat together in warm kitchens, ordinary life, resuming, slowly and imperfectly, in the country that had survived. Karelian refugees began building new lives in Western Finland, planting the first stakes in the ground of new homes. The Finnish parliament stood undamaged and functioning, a democracy that had fought for itself and remained itself. The Red Army restructured, re-equipped, and retrained, applying the bitter lessons of Finland to its future preparations. Hitler watched the Winter War closely and drew a conclusion about Soviet military capability that would prove catastrophically wrong. The Winter War's consequences did not end in March 1940. They echoed forward into every subsequent year of the conflict. Finnish spring came as it always came, indifferent to what men had done through the winter, melting the snow regardless. A white cross stood at the forest's edge, a name, a unit, dates between November and January, and wildflowers. Finnish children played in the last snow of winter, throwing snowballs, falling, laughing, alive in a country that had survived. Mannerheim's portrait looked out from the wall, the face of a man who was asked to hold the line, and did. The final map showed Finland diminished but present borders redrawn, but a Finland still on the map of Europe. From altitude, Finland looked exactly as vulnerable as it had always been, and it was still there, against all expectation. A flame burned at the Finnish memorial through the evening, steady and warm, for the names carved into the stone. The forest was silent. The snow fell lightly through the pines. Finland endured as it had always endured, alone in the dark.